Welcome to Grappling with the Gray, a forum for promoting the development of an ethical mindset and ethical decision-making to help us better see both sides of complex issues and navigate the moral challenges of everyday life. I'm Rabbi Yonason Goldson, and I'd like to welcome my panelists today. I have Sarah Elkins, who is a communicator and leadership coach using the power of storytelling to connect, engage, and inspire. Mark O'Brien is founder and principal of O'Brien Communications Group, helping companies manage their brand, solve their problems, and simplify the complex. And Matt Rosenberg teaches communication, argumentation, and critical discourse. I know you were teaching at Oregon State University, but now you're going to be at Washington University this year. Is that right?
A little bit, yeah.
Excellent, excellent. Well, thank you all for joining me this afternoon.
Thank you.
And here is our ethics challenge for today. Popular movies are often introduced with a message based on true events, implying reasonably accurate depiction of reality. We take it for granted that there may be a bit of poetic license, but we would like to expect that the basic facts of the story will be authentically represented. But that's not always the case. A few examples. The movie Remember the Titans is about Herman Boone, a Black football coach in the Deep South in the 1970s. In the movie, his team was the only racially integrated team in their conference. In reality, all the teams were integrated by then. In the movie Cinderella Man, boxing champion James Braddock goes into the ring against Max Baer, who had killed another boxer in a previous fight. The movie portrays Baer as a homicidal sociopath. In reality, he was horrified by his opponent's death and had to be convinced not to retire from boxing altogether. In the movie Argo, the final scene shows Iranian security officials chasing Ben Affleck's plane down the tarmac as it carries the American escapees to safety. The scene was a Hollywood fabrication. And in general, what about historical fiction? Does it bring history to life, or does it blur the lines between fact and fiction? So keeping all that in mind, it's been said that you shouldn't let the facts get in the way of good story. What responsibility do storytellers have to be truthful? When do we cross the line from poetic license into the realm of fantasy or deception? What are the effects on society when the truth isn't good enough to keep an audience engaged? The floor is open.
Wow.
Well, I'd like to start with that whole, what if the story isn't good enough to keep an audience engaged? That's not the story's fault. That's the teller's fault. It has nothing to do with the story.
Good call. I maybe I'm more mindful than most about this, but when I see something that says based on a true story or historical fiction, I simply take it for granted that there will be a creative license taken with it. For whatever this is worth, I don't read historical fiction because I just don't enjoy it. But I do watch films that are based on true stories, but I take them with a grain of salt. And I may not be a typical movie watcher, but I think still, in my experience, the only time I've ever been compelled to lose sight of the fact that I'm watching an actor at work in a product was when I watched Raging Bull. And that's clearly historical fiction.
And what happened? What was the result of that? Did you go and look it up so you could find out more of the truth?
Well, yeah, being a boxing fan, I kind of knew a fair amount about Jake LaMotta anyway. And it didn't trouble me that I separated Jake LaMotta from the Jake LaMotta character in the movie. I don't know if that's things that people typically do. I don't know.
But that's from that's from the viewer's perspective. I think the question is the responsibility. Like the teller has, I mean, if somebody tells a bad story, right, and I'm not engaged, like, okay, right? But if somebody has the power to use words to communicate a vivid image to us and influence us, through that? Does it matter whether it's true or not?
Yeah, good question. I guess I'd have to say, as an Irish storyteller, it's not my inclination to let the truth stand in the way of a good story, but I like to think that I telegraph enough of the ridiculousness or the absurdity that I put into some of the things I write, that most people would be aware of that.
Well, and then the next question is, although, I mean, in a perfect world, anyone watching, it would be their responsibility just as much as it was the person putting out the information to find out what version of the truth it is, if it's, whatever. That's in a perfect world. But we all know that people are often influenced and don't look to find out the truth or more information, even if there is no clear truth. What's the information? I always come back to harm. What is the harm that can be done? And I recently went to see Hamilton, the musical in Denver, and it was beautifully done. The rap style music was amazing, like just incredibly talented individuals in the show. I was extremely disappointed at the role the women played in it, which was basically, I'm so in love with Hamilton, oh, woe is me. Like they had no personality, they had nothing in their own lives, and they played very small roles, and they had huge influences across that time. So I was really discouraged by that. I mean, I'm used to seeing that in history in the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, but in 2020, you would think that they would, understand the role women played in history and not just ignore it. But the bigger question for me was the very end. There was a song that the widow of Hamilton sings about who tells the story and what damage it does based on who ends up telling the story. So the story has always been told from the perspective of Hamilton, making Aaron Burr a horrible, horrible human, a murderer, which he was a murderer. He killed him. But we get this one-dimensional viewpoint of a character, and we all know the humans are complicated. So it feels like the writer and producer of this show actually acknowledged the complexity of the humans in this show in a way that I haven't really seen before. So I don't know. I thought that it was his responsibility now, as we know more, as we understand history in different ways, when we read different viewpoints. But that's where I'm coming from right now, is thinking about that show.
It's interesting that you mentioned that, Sarah, because it has been such an extraordinary success. I haven't seen it, but I am in the middle of the audiobook on which it's based, and I'm, I love the book because it brings out Hamilton's extraordinary genius and vision, while not whitewashing any of his faults.
Right, exactly. Definitely acknowledges his faults.
Right.
His humanity.
Right.
His humanity, if we're going to call it anything, it's his humanity.
Yeah, and we don't want to stylize our heroes. Matt
Anymore.
In the Jewish world, we sometimes fall prey to this, making great figures so pristine that there's no way we can relate to them as role models, which is not really what the point of telling their life stories is. But it's interesting what you said, Mark, that you go in not expecting too much veracity. I don't know, and maybe it's just my personality, probably is, but on the one level, I know I shouldn't be believing filmmakers. They're not terribly reliable sources. And yet I want to believe the story. And if it's a story based on truth, I want it to be true. Now, I mentioned the case of Argo, and I heard Ben Affleck talking about it. He said, we have no idea whether the plane was being pursued. But we wanted to be able to demonstrate the tension they felt on the plane as they're taxiing down, not knowing whether they're going to be able to actually take off and get home. And I think that's a pretty reasonable explanation. And I'm willing to forgive them that fabrication because, like you said, Sarah, it doesn't do any harm. Whereas in the case of Remember the Titans, so much of the story was about the players overcoming their racial tensions, being the only team that was going through this. And when I found out that that's not the way it happened, I felt cheated.
Wow.
So
I'm sorry, go ahead.
I was thinking, like, what parts of the story are you willing to stretch in order to to feel good about it, as or verify it as true?
That's
I mean, like, how much
story, isn't it?
I mean, how much percentage of a story, like if you were going to make a law for Hollywood, like how much percentage of a story actually has to be true, you know?
I think that's a question that can be more broadly asked. And I don't know if you're familiar with the late novelist Frederick Exley. He called history the biggest lie. And I think actually what he was alluding to was something that you were suggesting, Sarah. I have trouble with the notion of the truth. I mean, I do believe in objectivity, but because we're all different with different perspectives, you know, there are enormous problems with eyewitness testimony because people's perspectives are just so different. And again, I have no idea if I'm typical or representative. I'm not interested in the truth if I'm watching a movie. And I'm always conscious of willful suspension of disbelief. Have you seen the 2017, I think, Guillermo del Toro film, The Shape of Water? I was, first of all, it is so incredibly beautiful. But I was able to see it on this big screen in a 1940s vintage art cinema at Trinity College in Hartford. And I know I didn't blink through the entire movie. And if my father had been there, he probably would have said I was catching flies because I'm sure my mouth was hanging open. But the very first thing that went through my mind when that movie was over were the negative reviews of the movie that I had read before I even saw it. And I thought immediately, those folks don't know anything about the willful suspension of disbelief. I mean, there's just no way in the world 90% of that movie could have been real. Didn't matter to me at all. It's an amazing story, beautifully presented.
So it was about entertainment, not about truth. You don't go to a movie to find truth.
You know what? That's a very good point, Sarah, because like the plague, I will avoid horror movies or movies that I know beforehand are going to have sad endings. I have plenty of that in my life. I want to be entertained. Thank you very much. Yeah, good point. Thank you.
Matt, what were you going to say?
I sort of, what I was hearing with Mark's comments, and I kind of am agreeing as I listen, is that I'm not really sold that there's any responsibility on the artist to create, honest art. Like, art seems to have a rule-breaking history, right? Like, that's what art is. Entertainment, by definition, is a distraction or an engagement, right? So I'm sort of, when we bring up the examples that at the beginning, they seem to not have, I'm not sold that responsibility lies in the writer or the artist. Like,
I think there is some. Only because there could be so much damage done. So much damage. I'm thinking about 16 Candles. There's nothing true about it, not a true story, nothing truthful about it. You know what was entertaining in the 80s? date rape. That was entertaining in the 80s. That's how people thought that that was funny in that movie. Those Cinderella stories. There's one out right now, The Summer I Turned Pretty. You want to talk about damage. And okay, it's not their responsibility. And all they're responsible for is to make money, to put out entertainment, whatever. But, and it is my responsibility to tell my niece, don't go watch that movie. This is crap. I'm not going to show my nieces the movie 16 Candles that I loved growing up, or Pretty in Pink, or 10 Things I Hate About You. All the 80s movies that encouraged all these girls to have eating disorders because they were heavy, or to get rid of their glasses and put in contacts, even if they damaged their eyes, you know, all this stuff about being beautiful and how important that was in the 80s. So granted, they don't have a responsibility. However, we also can't count on the masses to learn lessons easily. So I don't know. I have really mixed feelings. Obviously, I have really mixed feelings about this.
It's an interesting conversation when it comes to art and entertainment, because I as an artist myself, I find that, you know, the whole point is not adhering to the rules or my own preconceived notions about the world. And is it, I mean, do I have, can I not show that? And if you don't want to watch it, then is that really, I mean, I don't know, because as you said, like, we can't rely on the masses. It seems to be that, but if I'm an artist and I have a message, and the truthiness of the video is the message.
Good word.
Right? It's the message, not the actual things that happened. Like certain things that happened in the Remember the Titans, like he didn't have a girlfriend, I guess. There's a lot of like other details that like didn't, you know, exist. Like, can you change those details and it still be called true because the message is, you know, the running down the tarmac? Like, we wanted to express the urgency of it, like, because the message is true. Can that change? Can I put out true message but completely fabricated content, and that's okay?
Well, look at what's happening in Russia right now. Their entertainment is all flipping the story, right?
One of the tropes that I use again
Greater good, no?
is that there's no app for ethics.
Right.
You
Right.
can't just
Does it
write.
pass your gut test?
Yeah, I mean, and there's the problem with compliance laws is you're relegating ethical decisions to a code. And while you need to do that on a certain elemental level, you have to leave room for individual judgment. And I sympathize with everything, all those movies, none of which I've seen, Sarah. But I certainly.
You're not missing anything.
Well, yeah. There's a quote that I learned in junior high school by Ursula K. Le Guin, the science fiction writer, and it has stuck with me. She said, "Disbelieve everything I say. I'm telling the truth." And her point was that the job of fiction is to communicate universal truths through a made-up story. And I'm completely on board with that. I mean, that's fundamental to Judaism, the concept of allegory and parable. There's research that shows that people who read literary fiction have greater empathy and greater sensitivity to morals than people who read nonfiction. Because when you put the message in a story and the story is compelling and it has the right storyteller, I'm a huge fan of Harry Potter. I think she did a magnificent job of putting in so many substantive lessons and insights into a really compelling story. And I think she deserved to have it be so successful. My original question, though, is, does the same thing apply to nonfiction in an entertainment story? So, you asked the question, Matt, how accurate do we have to be? So, in the movie Miracle about the 1980 U.S. Olympic hockey team,
Great
They
movie.
have this scene where, fantastic movie, fantastic story. They have this scene where the Russians score a goal and they knock over the goalie, and it looks like he's not going to be able to go back in the game. And those two things happen separately, but they streamlined it for the purpose of the movie. I have no problem with that. That degree of accuracy in a docudrama, if you will, I don't think that's something we have to worry about. And certainly as a professional speaker, we'll streamline stories. But you start flirting with these lines of how much to embellish and when to change and when to, and I think that flirting with the truth can make us less sensitive to our commitment to the truth in other areas. Am I being overly worried?
I don't know if you're being overly worried, but I think there are elements here of responsibility, as suggested by Sarah, and control, and who's responsible. I mean, in the relationship between teller and, I don't know what you want to, audience, how's that? Where's the responsibility there, and who is supposed to control what? As a late blooming college student, I was old enough to appreciate two books that I was compelled to read for a particular course, and one was Kenneth Burke's Language as Symbolic Action, and another one is Wolfgang Iser's The Implied Reader in the Text. And both of those helped me understand that writing and reading are sort of reciprocating participatory exercises. So given what you said, Sarah, it makes me think that as a storyteller, I have a responsibility to be mindful of the people who might read my story. I'll give you one example. I wrote this thing. I couldn't have imagined writing anything more obviously ridiculous. And I called it My Visit to Harvard. And I made up this scenario in which the editors of the Harvard Business Review had seen something I wrote, took exception to it, and invited me up to talk to them. That whole thing was contrived. I contrived a history of Cambridge that's just so completely ridiculous, and put some other things in there that I just never even imagined I'd get away with. People believed it. I've spoken with people who believed it and asked me questions about it, and I'm like, whoa. So
Satire.
well, there's the perfect word. But so where's the responsibility and the control in that if you're writing satire?
I don't think that you can write for every audience. I mean, we all know that.
Yeah.
The question is, what damage does it do? And what is the potential for growth as a result of writing that?
Whose growth?
For you and for the reader. So I know that everybody is not my audience. And I'll tell you, I gave a keynote last month, and one evaluation came back saying, like, very critical of the topic, which was that we shouldn't be calling our workplace a family, that's way too complicated. Family is complicated. And so I talked about that. And when I received this note, well, I thought I was insulted because this is really how I see my workplace. And I thought, that's the person that I needed to reach. Right? The one person who didn't like it is the one that needed to hear the message. So sometimes I think it's your responsibility to do it anyway, even when you know you're going to poke somebody, because some people need to be poked. But the question is, it comes back to, is your responsibility to the truth, to growth, I think it just depends on what your goal is when you produce a film that says based on a true story. What's the goal here? Is it to villainize somebody? Or is it to share a really interesting story? Because then your responsibility shifts, I think, and how you present it has to shift. So in your case, putting this is satire across the top, people will miss it, but at least you made an effort to say, this is not truth. And when you see a movie producer saying based on a true story, if they acknowledged, this may demonize somebody that doesn't deserve to be demonized. Like, I don't know how you do that, but I think it depends on what's the goal of it and how do you make that clear to your audience.
And Jonathan, in our interpretations of these things and our judgments about the ethics of it, do we allow for subjectivity? Because if we think about, to use Sarah's example, somebody who's creating a piece of entertainment based on a true story, that storyteller's perspective is going to be, to one degree or another, subjective. I want to do this with my story. I want this particular character to appear to be that. And I guess that's why in the context we're discussing, I don't even think about the truth. It never even occurs to me to wonder if it's true or not. I'm being entertained. I know what the filmmaker wanted me to perceive. Cool. Then it's over.
If it was only that common, Mark.
Yeah.
If
I
you
think
were the
that's
majority.
Oh, well.
I think that's part of the point. And you've already mentioned this, is what can we, or maybe what should we expect from the audience? When you're communicating to children, you take into account their lack of experience and sophistication, and you tailor the message. I mean, there's all kinds of debate about Santa Claus and the Tooth Fairy. Should we tell our children these things are real, and then at some point spring on them, hey, guess what? We made all that stuff up. And that's a different discussion. But I think there's a kernel of relevance in there. And in Jewish tradition, we have a whole area of rabbinic literature called midrash. And they are stories that are part of the oral tradition. Some of them are obviously meant to be historically true. Some of them are obviously meant to be purely allegorical. And some of them it's not clear. And
those are the ones I'd enjoy the most.
Yeah, well, I've gotten into many discussions about why were the sages ambiguous? Did they intend to be ambiguous? Was it clear to them and it's just not clear to us? And now what do we do when we have stories about historical figures and we're not really sure whether we should treat them as biography or as legend? And we kind of end up in and sometimes maybe that's the point. When Jonathan Swift wrote A Modest Proposal, probably maybe the most brilliant piece of satire ever, he wrote it so dispassionately that he got people sort of nodding and thinking, this sounds reasonable. Why don't we cook up?
Maybe we should eat the children.
Yeah, let's just say, the poor children, maybe we can turn them into something useful by serving them up on a platter, literally. And it is maybe is a force of social change. Maybe that was the right way to handle it. We're just
Matt, you kind of mentioned the responsibility of the audience at one point. Where would you go with that?
With the audience?
Yeah, what our responsibility is and what you can count on. I mean, because you can't, but
I don't know. I'm not like Mark is saying, I look at it, I'm being entertained, I see things for what they are. I feel like I've seen a lot of things that I thought I was seeing what was real. And then later I'm like, well, wait, that wasn't what happened. I mean, I have a few kids, you know, you walk in and one's holding a stick and the other one's crying, right? Like, what happened in here? And they're like, no, that didn't happen, but it sure looks like it did, right?
Yeah.
And it turns out that it never happened. Like I'm not so sure that I have to, yeah, like Mark said, I have this willing suspension of belief, right? For a moment, like it is entertainment. I find that. I'm really not sold that. I feel like trying to control the artist or having the artist have to, you know, think about an audience so much, you know, it can be you mentioned something, Sarah, about like the damage that things can do, but also I was thinking like, well, what help can things do? You know, at the same time, like things don't always, if you're saying yes to one thing, you're saying no to something else. So if it's not the damage, like what is good that's happening, that could also be a thing. I mean, exposure, you know, helps us cope sometimes.
We are at the end of our first segment, and I think we could probably find some more stuff to talk about in the second.
You think?
So we're going to take a break here, and I would like to thank my panelists for an absolutely stimulating and insightful conversation. Sarah Elkins, Mark O'Brien, and Matt Rosenberg, thank you very much. If you would like to, the audience, if you would like to suggest an ethical scenario or dilemma for discussion, please go to my website, jonasandolson.com, and use the contact box to submit your proposal. If you have an idea that's compelling, we will certainly take it up. If you are a Grappling with Gray member, please use the community link to participate in a follow-up open forum and continue discussion right now. If you are not a member, please go to gwtg.live. That's gwtg.live. And you can sign up for a 30-day free trial to enjoy member benefits. Please join us again next week for another ethical discussion as our panel grapples with the gray.